Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I join my colleagues on the floor here today to address this afternoon concerns we have with the foreign policy of the Trump administration. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Menendez of New Jersey, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and comment first at the outset on two things that have been widely said that I just don't think are true. First, that Democrats are bottling up the president's vitally needed nominees for senior ambassadorial positions or senior Department of State nominations, and that we're holding key nominees. Frankly, I think nothing could be further from the truth. Earlier today in a business meeting, our Foreign Relations Committee, which works well on a bipartisan basis, voted out a whole series of ambassadors, treaties, assistant secretaries of state. And second, I've heard it said by some pundits that Democrats wish President Trump ill, that we are working to do everything we can to hold him back and prevent him from being successful. So let me start by saying I think all of us know that we are strongest when we stand together and work together. All of us have at some point heard the old adage that politics should stop at the water's edge, and nothing would make me happier than to see our foreign policy, our military, and our diplomatic efforts succeed around the world. I do not wish our president ill or our State Department a lack of success. But I think it deserves mentioning for the few minutes I'm taking on the floor today that President Trump, who promised as a candidate to be unpredictable and non-traditional, has overperformed in that category. His foreign policy has been defined by inconsistency, volatility, unpredictability, and at times a failure to advance our values. This comes exactly at the time, as my colleague from Connecticut was just reciting, when our allies and partners crave stability and leadership, and when the threats to our democratic way of life from Russia and China are on the rise. Trump's shock and awe style of governing was demonstrated recently by his abrupt firing of the Secretary of State in a tweet and his further humiliation of the Secretary of State in stories that dribbled out about exactly how and when and where he was fired. We should not be conducting foreign policy in the same way that one might host a reality TV show like The Apprentice. In just a year, as I've attended a variety of conferences and meetings around the world, I've been struck at the number of ways in which the president has undermined alliances and friendships that have taken decades to build. Let me just briefly review a few of the ways our European, African, and Asian allies have been puzzled or confounded by our withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, by imposing a travel ban on citizens from majority Muslim countries, by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, by imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, including against our close North American and European allies, by questioning our commitment to NATO, and by denigrating an entire continent when discussing the value of potential immigrants from Africa. Real and consistent leadership around the world that reflects American values is needed more now than ever. In the dozen countries I have visited at regional security conferences in the past year, I've heard the same from our vital allies. Senator McCain and I traveled to Halifax in Canada and to Singapore in Southeast Asia for a whole series of bilateral meetings with representatives of close and trusted allies. Senator Flake and I have traveled to Africa. Senator Graham and I have traveled to the Middle East. In all of these trips, what I heard was that our allies are concerned, that they need reassurance about how and where we stand, and that in many cases, yes, they are beginning to move on past us and to reach accommodations with China or Russia, having concluded that we are not committed to engagement with the world. Every time I go on a visit to a foreign embassy, an embassy of the United States overseas, I sit down with our foreign service officers and I ask about their work and their service, and I am overwhelmingly impressed with their professionalism, with their dedication, our career development professionals and diplomats. Yet overwhelmingly, the big number of vacancies at the senior level in the State Department and a budget that proposes a more than 30% cut in the State Department and in USAID has had a significant demoralizing impact on these people who we count on to advance America's interests and values around the world. Let me also say briefly that on the continent of Africa, where I have spent a great deal of my time on the Foreign Relations Committee, we are missing ambassadors to some of the biggest or most important countries, South Africa, Tanzania being just two, for example. And it's a continent where China's pervasive presence is not being countered by an America that is robustly engaged. Why does this matter? Because in this century, Africa will become the fastest growing, largest market for our goods and should be the continent in which we have the closest alliances and partnerships. But instead of building partnerships, and helping expand markets to create jobs here at home, the Trump administration is squandering the current economic momentum and watching from the sidelines as democratic norms deteriorate. As a member of both the Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committees, I was gravely concerned that for the second year in a row, the Trump administration budget proposed deep cuts in diplomacy and development. We must recognize that while these investments, yes, serve a humanitarian purpose, they also make us stronger by spreading American values, safer by building coalitions, less susceptible to terrorism by creating a more stable world, and more prosperous by creating stronger export markets for our goods. If we want to remain a global leader, we need a strong State Department and USAID that are sufficiently funded. Let me turn to the matter of Russia before I conclude. Throughout his administration, President Trump has not only turned away from some of our critical allies and weakened our commitments to international coalitions, but has refused to head-on clearly address the real and multifaceted threats we face from Russia. Russia's activities, as has been testified to by senior administration officials over many hearings now, are directly interfering with our democracy, our last election, and likely our next election, as well as those of our closest allies throughout the world. Rather than sending a clear and forceful signal to Russia that our political affairs are not to be meddled with, President Trump has instead at times turned aside from this challenge and failed to address it. Let me conclude by simply saying, now more than ever, the United States must lead in the world, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Foreign Relations Committee on a bipartisan basis to advance our interests. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.